Terror on Tunnel Ridge. It's been over 2 decades now since my brother Ferguson vanished. He hated that name. He would have been mortified to learn the reports of his disappearance were all plastered with it. We, by which I mean my sisters and I, were, in youth, prone to calling him Fergus or Ferg to work him up. Ferguson was the youngest of us, and we 3, so seldom united on anything, were always ready to remind him of that, even in jest. But it was only ever that, just fun, ribbing, familial annoyance. Most of the time, he was Doug to us. He didn't like that middle name, Douglas, either, but it was as close as he could get to escaping Ferguson, and our parents eventually conceded to calling him by it. So Doug was how we knew him, really, and that's how I'll refer to him here. Doug may well have been the youngest of us, but he was far from the most helpless. We'd all grown up rugged and rough in Wolfe County, shadowing the streams amidst shading hills as we supplemented the sparse family diet with game. But he had carried love of that life far into adulthood, never abandoning his love for untamed living once stability became available to him, as so many of us did. In adulthood, he'd always managed staggered work, living cheaply out of cars or shared rentals while building up enough to coast for a while. His real passions, along with these carefully scavenged funds, were spent in months-long disappearances into Wilderland. Whether it was squatting on parkland or rugged living over harsh northern winter or brutish southwestern summer on Bureau of Land Management tracts, Doug was seldom in one place for long. By the time he was 30, he'd weathered wet Alaskan Januaries and fished his way through muggy Florida Augusts. He had kayaked the length of the Kentucky and Ohio rivers to the Mississippi and on to the Gulf, camping and squatting rough along the way. He was more at home, pitted against the elements, than most men I know settled into firm and comfortable employment with homes and families to their names are with their own lots in life, and he deeply relished the freedom he felt in that environment. I, or friends he'd made along the way, would often serve as support networks for him as he got these excursions off the ground. Such was the case with this last trip, a challenge to the winter, to be endured out in the gorges beyond Courthouse Rock. He'd set out in late November, well before the temperatures truly dropped, and before most chance of real snow had set in. This would offer him ample time to build up a subtle, crude rock overhang shelter down low in the deepest forest ranging out towards the chill Red River, before harsher weather set in come December. He was not, of course, strictly allowed to conduct this sort of long-term, rough-hewn, over-season camp by the rules of the park, but his infatuation with this area we'd grown from boyhood in, and his affection for our wider region's history of early, ungovernable settlement, meant this was not an issue to him. His goal, I took it, was to remain undetected through till February, like some early squatting settler fresh into 18th century Appalachia ducking tribal or colonial detection before the routes west were opened up. Then he would, as he'd so often done before, strip down his sight to be as it was the last fall, and emerge having experienced a quiet and contemplative winter in the shadows of the cliffs, and thumbed his nose at the quaint little laws and strictures of man into the bargain. It was well into the afternoon of Monday the 26th when he set out, the Monday after Thanksgiving, in '01. I was the one who drove Doug up. We picked the day because we anticipated the park would be mostly empty on a weekday evening so soon after a time most people would have had off work or school. This was aided by a glum, wet, low 40s weather which set an ominous fog and shivering atmosphere about the feet of the cliffs. There were 2 other cars parked in the lonely picnic area at the head of Gray's Arch Trail, and both had packed up and left before we finished unloading around 3. We'd brought a sturdy little garden cart along in the bed of my truck, and had it loaded up with provisions and supplies for Doug's stay. While he'd generally prefer to kill or find all his own food, the stealthy nature of his stay would limit his abilities in this regard, making a hefty supply reserve mandatory. We checked his kit, went through the cart's heavy load one final time, and then locked up and walked on our way up the long gravel road. The park gates off Tunnel Ridge Road when winter draws near, not at the mouth before one crosses the bridge onto the ridgeline, but rather just past the picnic area at Gray's Arch. This keeps some overconfident sightseers from Cincinnati or Lexington getting stranded in any sudden deep snows. It's a 3-mile haul from that picnic area up the gravel to where the real trail kicks off. This is one of the benefits to the cold season in Red River Gorge. The number of people willing to actually put in the minimal effort of strolling 3 miles just to reach the start of a couple of 2-mile trails dwindles with the falling of the leaves. And often, treks like Auxier and Double Arch, isolated as they are from other loops in the park, are left empty until the road along the ridge opens back up in spring. Being from this neck of the woods, we were both quite familiar with trails all over the gorge, but these in particular were second nature to us by now. We wove without incident up to the lot at the end of the road, the cart crunching soft over the wet gravel. Then we hauled up the Auxier Ridge Trail, taking care not to spill the supplies on rock, root, or switchback. We reached the path just shy of Rocky Wizard's Backbone by 5, when the sun was drawing low out west. Doug had picked a winding little path of slick slopes amidst the rock faces which would take him off-trail down into the gorge proper, and we offloaded the cart for him to begin his runs on foot down into the deepening shadows of the ravine. As a slow dusk began to set in, we said our goodbyes, and I turned around for the long walk back to the truck, dragging the emptied cart with me. My next supply run would be in December, and I'd need it to bring the next load of provisions up. It was a routine thing, that goodbye. We'd had many identical partings before. It was the passive exchange of my wishes I could be out there with him rather than working, and Doug's wishes I could join him. Some half-committal plans for me, and perhaps our father, to slip out for a weekend in January to spend a while with Doug. It was dark by the time I hit the gravel of Tunnel Ridge Road, but the hour's stroll back to the truck was quiet and tame. I had no inkling of strangeness, or what was to come. I had no clue as I rolled out over the bridge and onto Campton Road that it was the last night I'd see my brother alive. Well, I was back to work the next day, and time, as ever, rolled on. Doug was silent most days, as expected. Part of the purpose of his outing was to have his time fully in his own hands. But he did send occasional updates on his durable little Nokia about fires he'd built on the frost-haunted banks of the Red River, or of the progress on his overhang shelter. The investigation afterwards, looking into his phone traffic, indicated he'd climb up out of the gorge onto the ridge to get signal for sending these messages. Texts were expensive and cumbersome back then, but calls were all but impossible with what little service there was out there in the hills. Otherwise, the phone stayed off. His final dispatches came on the 5th of December, when he messaged my father wishing him a happy birthday. Later that evening, just after dusk, he asked me if I still had game cameras on my land, and asked me to bring him as many as I could spare when I visited later in the month to drop supplies. I asked him what it was he wanted to photograph. The phrasing of his last text seemed to me to imply some sense of urgency about those cameras. Perhaps I'm reading too much into it, given what was to happen, but I don't think so. He had apparently turned his phone off before that follow-up question was received, and for a full week afterward, it remained unread. I messaged him around the 16th asking about the upcoming supply run, but again, The message never got through on his end. And as each day passed without any sign of acknowledgement from Doug, I grew more and more nervous. By the 20th, I was scared. The sheer length of this quiet was unprecedented, and though my father, when I'd call him up to consult, was quick to say Doug was capable and likely just content and secure in his place out there in the gorge, I had a growing feeling this was not true. This dread deepened as Christmas drew nearer, and still my messages went unopened. I had anticipated celebrating Christmas morning with my wife, parents, and siblings at the family home that year, and then driving out around noon to hike in Doug's December supply run on the cart. It would give me a chance to sit and burn a fire with my brother, and get a sort of evening visit in to usher out the day. But worried as I was, I eventually decided I could not wait. On the night of the 23rd, I gathered his supplies. Then, during the mid-morning of Christmas Eve, I took the drive out onto Tunnel Ridge, aiming to find my brother up near Courthouse Rock, and, if necessary, get him the help I secretly feared he needed. As fate would have it, one of the heavier snows of the season began falling before dawn. By the time I'd risen and driven out towards Campton, half a foot had built up on the roads. I weighed down the empty bed of the Ford with bags of chicken feed and leaned on the four-wheel drive to get me out over unplowed asphalt and powdered gravel. But it was still a slick and slippery trip. All the while, the flakes were still drifting down from the iron-gray sky overhead. Slow, but steady. I crossed the bridge over the mountain parkway and rumbled up the hill which begins Tunnel Ridge around noon. I was delayed a few moments halfway to the Gray's Arch parking area when a couple older women in a sedan mired in the snow off the side of the road flagged me down, asking if I had a tow line. I didn't. They had plenty of gas to keep warm in the idling car, and I still had service to call a proper tow out from Jackson. So once I was sure they had what they needed to wait it out, I pushed on. I never asked what brought them up there, but I'd imagine they were staying at a cabin and thought they'd come out to see the forest under the snow. Whatever the case, I'd later learn from authorities that they'd left the following hour with their towed car. Those two represented the only human presence I was to glimpse on the ridge that day. By the time I parked and reached the gate barring the remainder of the road with my cart crunching snow behind me, my prints were the sole disturbance in the clean marble carpet, blanketing the gravel and sand of the path. The walk out was beautiful, tainted only by the worry which had driven me to make it. The forest, as ever, under thickening snowfall, was quiet. The occasional snap of a dead branch under deepening drift, or the subtle echo of a bird's thrumming wings through the skeletal pillars of the icy forest, were the lone competition to the grinding progress of the cart and the clumsy crunching of my boots in the powder. Stray rays of sun slipped momentarily free of the clouds now and then to cast dazzling dances of color in the pale depths of the glazed scrub and bramble of the underbrush. The odd gust of wind rocked the creaking canopy above, and tipped frigid clouds of snow down onto the forest floor to either side of the drowned road. I reached the Auxier Ridge trailhead at 1:30, a bit slower than usual, given the sluggish tug on the cart wheels. The trail itself proved much slower, for rock and root were hidden in the snow to trip or trouble, and the grip of the cart's tires was tested grazing the icy surface of stone beneath the fall. And yet, still the poised beauty of a time-frozen forest in winter's grip was all around me, and even in the face of my worry, it made the trip seem short. Another hour and a half out to Wizard's Backbone, where I abandoned the cart and began to pick out the subtle, winding route down through the afternoon haze. First, I would find Doug, I told myself. The supply could come afterward. The terrain was strange under the snow. but the gurgling of a light stream down below honed my attention after a few false starts down the treacherous way. The holler into which I was descending was just north of the one carved by Fish Trap Branch. While there is no marked route down, and the smaller creek there is unnamed so far as I know, the noise of a tiny waterfall betrayed its identity to me at a distance. I slid the way down on my rear, bracing against branches and clearing off a path to climb back up as I went. But with the snow still sinking down to the slope in fat flakes as the day grew long, I knew I would have to be quick if I wanted to trace the way back up before it was covered over. It was slick, but I am of the hills, like Doug was. I had taken far more dangerous slopes in boyhood. A tame hobby hunter who counts points on bucks and observes seasons and tags due to having a full fridge back home, or the sort of apartment-dwelling outdoorsman who spends perhaps 10 or 12 nights a year beneath an open sky, might protest the danger of the path. To me, though, dangerous as it might be, the way down was a thing of intuited second nature, even in the snow. So too would it have been for Doug, even more so, frankly, given how wild he had remained into adulthood. My senses were dulled by the fat of plenty and the fear of losing that comfort which mutes and strangles the reflexes and courage of so many men. His had suffered no such decline, and though I feared for him given the silence, I still held hope he was down there, waiting to be surprised by my visit. I found the holler vacant. I called out through the trees several times, my voice ringing out over the Red River to reverberate off the rocky walls beyond with no leaves to deaden it. But beyond a bolting doe half glimpsed near the riverbank, no answer came. And so I had to search. Winding south along a cliff bottom, I found a promising overhang. The open mouth of this natural shelter had been piled high with flat stone hauled up from down by the riverside, and within, the snow and damp had been kept at bay. It was a dry little crag of my brother's making, with a ring of stones around a spent bed of coals at its mouth. Further in, his pack and food stores rested firm against the wall. And gazing up into that shadowed shelter, which should have been warm with a low blaze in that spent fire pit, I at once understood something to be very, very wrong. There was too much food, for one. I knew Doug well enough to believe he was likely intending to do some modest trapping and even fishing under the table down here while he hid and this corner of the park stood mostly empty, supplementing what he'd brought with him. But even assuming the odd possum had helped keep him fed over the course of late November and the first few weeks of December, there was far too little missing here for Doug to have kept a comfortably full stomach. Even more, the pack held his thick winter gloves and socks and scarf when I opened it. His boots were stood up against it, and while, like many of us, Doug was known to be most comfortable barefoot, he was not immune to the cold and wet. While he did not have the soft feet of a modern man whose babied soles never suffer without the rubber coffins of shoes, he did not walk on snow or scrabble barefoot over damp dirt when the night's temperatures might dip down close to zero. And for him to have willingly allowed his fire to sputter out its last, without a single buried bed of ember left to breathe life into a new blaze, seemed impossible. As I straightened up and looked around, calling out again, I registered that just as above on the trails, my boot prints were the only marks in the snow. Sure, here and there the tiny chicken-like pecks of some bird cropped up, and once the pads of some small coyote or wayward fox. But hard as I squinted at the ivory floor of the forest, I found no trace of motion or life left by Doug's passage. And so I paced and wound amidst barren trees, and continued to find nothing. At length I came down to the pebbled beach where the tiny runoff stream met the shallow Red River itself, no more than 100 yards down from his overhang shelter. The snow was near a foot deep now, and the smoothed stones of the shore made faint dips and rises in it as they deformed the drifts from below. Down here in the deeps of the gorge, it was windless, and the powder was left to lay right where it fell. The Titan boulders and looming jagged walls scattered about the foot of the holler, for which the banks of the gurgling little river are famed, were still green with moss against the chill. The lowest span of the valley hosted a stand of pines, and between the boulders and those needled trees, the place felt more lively somehow. And yet, it was also darker. The trees, now thick with growth as well as the piled snow, ate up the muted sunlight spilling down through the strangling cloud. The canyon itself cast great shadows as the sun westered and sunk. Standing there amidst towering stones and leaning boughs, I felt nervous. My voice shook as it rang out over the river and off the opposing cliff wall through the forest once more. At last, sweeping the slickened stone beach for the third or fourth time, I saw a smooth, cylindrical shape wreathed in snow leaned against the foot of an angular boulder, twice my height. A hint of metal, silver, stark and dark amidst the white of the cover. Too perfect in form to be a thing of nature, some branch or stone discarded by swollen water or falling tree. Pacing for the thing, I pulled it up in gloves trembling from nerves rather than cold, to find it was a flashlight. Scraping away the snow at my feet with one boot, I saw the snapped haft of a small fishing rod pushed up against the base. Near this, his bear gun, thick and heavy, a Ruger revolver with two conspicuously empty chambers, twisted and snapped half down the handle. Not far off, a cap lay buried just shy of the waterline. It was damp and frozen stiff in the cold, and yet even against the dark blues of its fabric, I could see and smell the rusty tinge of blood. I could imagine him sitting there on the banks of the Red, barely a creek at that point in its run, plucking tiny fish from the cold water. And I could also paint horrid pictures in my mind, projections of fates befalling him there which grew more and more brutal by the second as I pondered them. I think I knew then Doug was dead. It bothers some people I say that so bluntly now, given his remains have never been found. But, given all that unfolded, it seems foolish to me to hold out hope he'll ever come back. For as I rose from the frigid stone with cap gripped tight in my hand to scan the beach again, I saw far up on the nearest stone the same great, lopsided behemoth I'd found the light leaned against, a ragged strip of frozen red fabric hanging limp from a hole. Beneath, a foot wide, rust-brown stain of long-dried lifeblood climbed the moss and stone to the aperture. Now, when I say hole, some who have never seen stone aged in mountains older than trees will not know what I mean. But much of the sandstone in Red River Gorge, as elsewhere in the region, is run through with a lattice work of often shallow dips and pockmarks left by long years of weathering, which look almost like the holes on a great ant or termite mound. These strange markings, which seem as if a burrowing worm or insect carved them, are particularly common in damp areas where water collects beneath shallow overhangs, or else along the river itself. Some are the size of fists, and others the breadth of a finger. The hole I had spotted, near 12 feet up the great stone beside me, was almost the size of my head, and the stained shirt matted flat to the rock like a wet towel, which was once stark white like the snow about me, was even now, after long days exposed to the elements, a vibrant red. My stomach sank. I felt ill. And then something happened there on that quiet riverbank which records do not show. Despite the fact I almost never have signal down in the gorge once I've left the ridge heights, my blocky phone rang. Recalling it now feels like summoning the details of a long-past nightmare. Portions are ironclad and yet details are hazy. But the image of the yellowish screen as I brought it up to my eyes is burned harsh into my memory. It was Doug's number. I answered, but there was no voice on the other end, no sound to indicate a connection. The blip of an ended call sounded, and at once I called back. And I heard the ringing which followed, the chime of a chirping tune familiar to me. It was muted, muffled, dulled, and yet somehow it was near. As I swung my eyes about the holler, or gazed right and left along the sweep of the Red River, I realized why. It sounded close because it was close. The ringing was reverberating out through the Swiss cheese pattern of gaps in the boulder at my side. The phone, I at once came to understand, was inside that stone. The ringing ended as suddenly as it had begun, and as the last note of it echoed out over the water, a loud crack came from off in the pines across the river. I straightened like a frightened autumn deer at the sound, but no motion accompanied the noise. I stared long into the shadows of the opposite bank's dreary, snow-strewn forest, and in them I could find no source for the sound. Yet my hair stood on end beneath the sweat-dampened neck of my coat, and I felt eyes on me as keenly as ever I'd felt them before. I wouldn't so much describe the sensation as feeling watched, but rather knowing I was observed. I glanced again at the bloodied shirt hung from that strange aperture in the stone, then back to the far bank. I drew breath, thinking to call Doug's name one final time. But something made me hold back, and the shout died with my foggy exhale over the water. I fumbled with the blocky little phone, meaning to call authorities, get a search and rescue effort organized, anything. But it was, as ever it had been down here in the gorge, void of any signal. A shrill noise welled up and echoed out of the stone beside me, then, jolting me alert. This was not the ringing of a familiar phone, but the gurgling keen of some great lunged force, something organic, and yet deep-seated in the earth about me. It was, as I say, shrill, and yet it reverberated deep off the walls either side of the river, the sheer scale lending it a rumbling force which shook the pebble beach underfoot. It did not last long, that horn-like whine, but by the time it faded away and the trembling stopped beneath my feet, I was already clambering back up the slope out of the unnamed holler Doug had made camp in, his hat and light gripped dumb in my hands. I don't know how I so smoothly scaled the steep drop into the valley save by long experience and adrenaline-fueled clarity, but I can say my mind was not wholly wrapped up in the mechanics of the escape. I remember nothing save sensations of the climb itself. What I can summon up with total clarity are my straining ears catching hints of noises back down in the vale behind, of crunched snowdrift or cracking branch which welled up like cracks of whips or shot to drive me onward. Then I was out onto the proper Auxier Ridge trail, careening past the cart loaded with Doug's unneeded supplies. I thanked heaven the prints I'd pressed into the deepening snow were still visible, and thundered on at a near jog through the trees past overlook and overhang and outcrop. For a time, my ears caught the thumping and cracking of something heavy down in the woods to my left, towards where the river ran unseen far below. But a mile's frantic passage carried the sounds off with it. This did not, however, dull that feeling of company, of observation. The sun was near gone beyond the strangling clouds, and as I slipped and stumbled for the road, I was always quick to rise on my aching legs, ever conscious of the passage of time. The slow winter storm which still dragged on overhead would eventually, over the course of the night to come, drop very near another foot of snow on top of the drifts already present. Much of the county, and its surrounding counties, would be stripped of power for a few days as branches broke and lines buckled under the weight of what, for us, was so rare a snow. The bloated flakes streaked past one's eyes in a renewed wind up here on the ridge, and together with the new layers being deposited on the ground, this made the prints I relied on to quickly trace my way amidst the bony scrub in the dim light more and more difficult. As I neared the mouth of the trail, and familiar trunks leered skeletal at me out of the dusky murk of the winter wood, glances were thrown back down the trail. And, horribly, now and then, I thought I saw a vague figure far off up the way beyond the gnarled fingers of grasping gust-shaken branches and billowing sweeps of powder, dark against the stark brightness of the swirl around me. When I did stagger breathless into the open lot heading the trail, and turn right for the long sweep of Tunnel Ridge Road, it was well and truly night. Though snow does amplify light and accentuate the hard lines of a forest at night, the waxing gibbous was well and truly drowned in the black clouds above, and the static of blown snow obscured anything which wasn't just a few feet away. The outlines of familiar landmarks like the lot outhouse or the parking signs and trail map kiosks along the eaves were shaky and uncertain. I drew out the phone again, and the weak gleam of the sickly yellow screen displayed the storm overhead was still too strong for signal to breach it. I placed it back in a pocket of the light pack I'd worn out, and stowed the bloody hat, which I realized I still gripped bunched in my petrified hand, in the main compartment with the water I'd hauled. I drank deep, the cold having for long hours hidden my growing thirst from me. And all the while I kept striding the path out onto Tunnel Ridge Road as it wound subtle among the trees, and maintained my constant glances back for the lot and Ogsier Ridge beyond. When I'd finished my drinking and settled into a good pace again, I had my old .22 in one hand, heedless now of meeting and frightening any winter hiker or camper on the way. The other gripped Doug's light like a club. I did not turn it on and risk deadening what night vision I could claim, but I did hold it ready. I jogged at first over the buried gravel, but I was soon slowed to a quick, long-striding trot. I told myself it was the swirling wind and driven snow in all those pale, barren trees to either side of my route, but deep among them, I often thought I glimpsed silhouettes or shapes striding the forest floor. Some seemed the height or shape of a wandering person, or perhaps a fleeing deer, but others were as vast blots on the deeper darkness behind. But whether these were figments of my frightened imagination, or tangible things slipped fast behind trunk or stump or stone through the storm, closer observation never revealed them. Several times I cast that wavering light of Doug's into the distance, half eaten by the moving mist of the frigid downpour, only to find the still shape of a lumpen stump or fallen tree, mired in all that whirling white. It was during this flight that voices seemed to surge up on the wind as it swept past my muffled ears beneath the cap I wore, gnawing at them, as if the subtle sounds laced through those boisterous gusts were tendrils trying to worm their way through the mind housed between. There were no words, just the formless, ancient, broad syllables of a force aged beyond man's measure, like some forest spirit or capricious forgotten god in an old Blackwood tale, almost tender in its coming. There was something familiar in that wind, something which ran far deeper than my acclimation to breezes rolling over forested hills. Amidst this, the familiar echo of cracked wood or disturbed snow crept to me now and then. Sometimes it was behind and sometimes ahead, but never could its source be made real for me with the flakes streaming past to sully my gaze. All I can say is that some of those sounds were vast and heavy, and far removed from the cracking fall of old trees toppled in high wind. These were a slow, sliding, slithering sound, something close to a flat-bottomed sled over hard-packed snow. This noise swelled with the unknowable wind words in the night, only to fade and eventually return, just as they did. And then, what must have been a frantic hour on through that pale tumult, as I closed in on the first lookout along Tunnel Ridge, just a few hundred yards from that waiting gate, and my truck beyond, I passed one of the camping pull-offs which sits along the road. There are a fair number of these, scattered along the ridge road, each with a small lot, an outhouse, and a few fire pits back off the main path to set up around for the less adventurous visitor. Some are elevated uphill, and others, like this one, are even with the gravel, and allow a passerby to stare over the lot up paths into the woods beyond. Motion beyond the chaos of the snow all about me, I should specify, caught my tired eye. Dark against the pale of the forest, slender, arms outstretched. It was a man, I thought. I stopped in place at the mouth of the lot, looking out towards it in the dark. Seconds dragged, and though movement had been what drew my eye, I could trace no twitch from it now. The figure was frozen stiff like a stilted cross, with only a mop of hair about an unseen head left to flutter and shift in the storm. Then those wind-borne whispers came again, and this time, for the very first time, I found meaning in some of them. I thought as I stood staring out into that lot that I heard the strained and weakened words, "Don't go," among the din. Then I flicked on the light, and curse me for it. Had I just had the good sense to leave it be, and keep my head down, and rush the last leg of the journey to the truck, the very worst of the night would not have found me. But perhaps thinking, or even hoping on some level, that it was a haggard Doug I'd seen out there in the haze, I illuminated it. And it was not a man. I refuse to believe that, even now, years removed from that awful panic and isolation and atmosphere. It had that vague form, but even through all the confusion of the storm which separated me from that figure 50 or 60 yards off at the woodline, I could tell it was a misshapen thing, the stuffed casing of some skinned beast, or person, held aloft by some greater force. I had the clear yet irreconcilable vision of a child with hand hidden in a glove puppet. But this was so much worse. The shadows and motion of that stormy evening conspiring to give its awkward stance and shape awful obscurity, and allow my mind to fill in the gaps. The hairy mass at its peak bobbed, and the bony limbs held up to either side swayed gently in the wind. "Come," came the murmured breeze voice in my ears. There was a thick shape, like a large trunk or drift, stretching off along the ground behind the figure. Again, the weather and hour made it vague, rough, haired, patchy with the sickly colors of ill flesh and tangled mane. And my eyes and light followed it. It wound like a great unspooled coil of pale piping out into the coated brush beside the stark lines of the outhouse at the rear of the lot. And there was a Titan hulk back there in the forest, larger several times over than the little building behind which it hid. And over the roof, thrust up among those frosted branches of the low-hung canopy, emerging like the head of some bird perched in a nest, was an elongated, shaggy head. It was giant, perched on fleshy serpent's neck. The features were not wholly human, and not wholly animal. Hircine, and yet rounded enough not to be snouted. No horns bobbed in the beam, and yet the eyes which glowed near gold in the light through the intervening snow had blocky, goatish, vacuous pupils. I fled, slipping and sliding in the drifts growing ever deeper on the uneven and ragged gravel underfoot. It could have caught me, no doubt, but though I heard the crashing and sluggish surging of its motion off in the trees as I went, it did not close in upon me. I cannot tell you why. If what I saw was truly there at all, that is. Perhaps it waited for me to answer its call, and when I did not, whatever plans it had were thwarted. Or perhaps it was the projection of a mind unsuited to such strain and upheaval. After all, as I've said, the records of the night show no calls from my brother's long silent phone, making it very possible I was not of right mind that Christmas Eve when all this played out. And yet, figment or not, whatever it intended, it was certainly not good. I drove home awash with sweat and dread that night, but the searchers sent out past Tunnel Ridge found nothing in the months to come. They confirmed the bloodied shirt in the wear hole on that moss-gnawed riverside boulder, and the presence of Doug's camp down in the holler, and the traces of a large amount of blood down on the pebble beach. But the boulder, despite its hive-like pattern of wear, was not hollow, and no bones or flesh or remnants of my brother beyond his spilled blood and scattered belongings were ever found, there or downriver. And so murmurs and speculation attributed the loss to a bear attack, despite the lack of traces indicating such an encounter. And so the record stands even now, decades removed from his loss. As one would imagine, I fast learned to keep the details of my own experience to myself. But at times like these, when snow falls thick on the hills outside, and the wind whips low over the roof, I can almost hear that old wordless whispering in it. The cold nights of the year are haunted by nightmares of red pools and strange forests, of glinting eyes and black forms cavorting in the deep glens and meadows of the winter wood. Now and then, jolting from sleep, I hear it once again on the breeze beyond window or brick. Come, it murmurs. Come to us. We are waiting. Thank you to patrons JHB, Noah Kaplan, Jennifer Tran, William Richardson, Luca Zanzi, Ryan Fahey, Laura, Ken Frausto, Wes, Weapons and Stuff 93, Strawman 1103, BJ Drapp, Jason Maki, William Copeland, Magpie Fly, Philip Blomquist, Rob, Ted Tarr, Sonia Van Buskirk, Colby Redding, Evan Graham, Icefire, Wait, did you just hear that noise behind us? Souptastic, CJ2845, Evan, Bongo, Jonas Pinna, Alteron, Aiden Pasco, Cool Story Bruh, Dumb Stuff Personified, Andrew Jackman, Philip Nordland, L. Monroe, Aubrey LaBoca, Dirt Person, Ruth, Totally a Human, Neo DRK, Jared, The Ganica, and Paul Baker. And thank you to YouTube members Big Shifty, Dumb Stuff Personified, James Ratliff, Sonia Van Buskirk, Jose Peyoto, Don Rottinghouse, Mad Topher, Gull Dukakis, Krampus Critiques, Don Dawson, Cheshire Vapor, Ryan Scott, Marco Miklos, Vega, Colonel Johnson, Canadine, Hoshea Kozilla, User Uzi, Foxy Paz Toddy, Gerard Santora, Vitor, Michael Clement, Timothy Pickett, Kung Tung, Billy Meter Jr., Trevor Canny, Bilbo's Stankface, Andrew Kane, Craig Sips, IT2, JHB, Americana, and Julius.